Recently, I've been doing more tests with the A1 and the A7S III from Sony based on some interesting results I discovered while doing my initial review of the A1, and today I'd like to share them with you. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and all my dreams are in false color. So today's video is going to be mostly unscripted because I know from the comments that you guys like the occasional conversational video. Now, regarding disclosure, this A1 here is still a loaner from Sony. I was able to convince them to let me borrow the camera again based on these tests that I wanted to do, but this video is not sponsored or endorsed by Sony, and they don't get to preview it before it's posted. This video does have a sponsor though, and that's Storyblocks. And in fact, let's get the sponsor message done with first, because I do want to take a minute to thank Storyblocks for sponsoring this video. Normally, I try to integrate them in the video in creative ways, but the truth is they make it possible for me to spend the time required to do the type of testing that I'm going to share with you in today's video, so I'm very appreciative of them. And I also really like their platform. They have an impressive collection of stock footage covering a wide range of subjects with unlimited downloads and 4K video. They're also amply supplied with backgrounds, overlays, and After Effects templates, and the interface is easy to use and navigate, and the clips are royalty-free for both personal and commercial use, so you can use them as much as you want, wherever you want. So if you think you could take advantage of a fantastic library of quality stock footage and effects, check out Storyblocks using the link in the description below. I also want to thank Camera Canada for lending me the battery grip that I used for some of these tests. They came in clutch on short notice, and they're a great store and my go-to camera retailer here in Canada. Okay, now speaking of that grip, let's talk about what it can do for the A1 when it comes to 8K video. So the grip in question is the VG C4EM vertical grip, battery grip from Sony. And this is the latest Gen 1, so it's for, A7R4, A7S III, and of course now the A1. It's got the new sort of AF on, a joystick button, and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I've got my notes here that I'm gonna go over with you. And in the 8K, in the 8K section video recording for the A1, my review, I mentioned that I'm able to get about 80 to 90 minutes on a single battery. And that's based on sort of a combination of things. It overheats around that 80 to 90 minute mark. One battery dies around 80 to 90 minutes. And if you're using like a 128 gig SD card, you'll probably get about 80 to 90 minutes. So it's kind of like, it's well balanced in that way, but that is sort of the upper limit for having a single battery in there. But when I use a dummy battery, in my A1 video, I showed you guys that I used a FZ100 style dummy battery, and on the other end, you could run this to a V-mount battery, or you could run it to mains power if you wanted as well. And when I did that, there was seemingly no limit regarding obviously there's no limit for battery power, and there was no limit with the overheating either. I think I ran at like 3.5 hours or close to 4 hours, and then I just stopped because I was like, okay, I'm bored. I think I'm gonna stop here because I've been recording for 3 hours and 12 minutes at 8K 24p, and there's not even a heat warning. And that's recording using a dummy battery. Now, obviously, you do have to relay record SD card over and over again and be swapping them in and out, which you can do when it's right into one, you put in two, and so on. And you can do that for a little bit cheaper because you can get away with just V60 cards. So I was doing it with these 128 gig Sony Tough M, which are the V60 cards, and it was fine. You could do 8K all the way up to their 400 megabit codec and just keep swapping these in and out. And you can do that essentially unlimited on dummy battery power. But that brought up the question of what about the grip? Because this grip, in case you didn't know, let me unscrew it for you, is sort of a dummy battery. Like, this is not a real battery. So it goes into the camera first, and then you screw it down, and that takes the battery out of the actual body of the camera. So the question was, how is that going to affect heat? Regarding power, inside of the grip, you use the same batteries. You put two FZ100 batteries in there. You know what I never tested? Let's actually do it right now on the video. Is can you run it with just one? So you can actually turn it on with just one battery, which is actually going to be an important update regarding USB charging that I want to mention later on. But anyway, so you put two batteries in here and you effectively get double the runtime, which makes sense. But how does it affect heating? So I did a bunch of rundown tests. If I were to give a quick review of the grip, by the way, I think it's fine. I don't really use vertical grips a lot for what I do, but if you were to, it's got the same great joystick, good AF on button. If you like the buttons in the grip of the A7S III, A1, you'll like the vertical grip as well. Anyway, okay, so let me tell you about the results. So when I did the rundown test with the vertical grip, I got 2 hours and 45 minutes on average. I ran it 3 times. And 2 hours and 45 minutes, which is actually pretty close to exactly double in every regard. The battery life was close to double because you get about 80 to 90 minutes. And it didn't, one time I got the overheat temperature warning thing to come on, but for the most part I didn't. But it does get very hot, just so you know, much hotter than the dummy battery does. So it seems like sort of an in-between step. It lasts longer and better and doesn't overheat as much as putting a battery inside, but it's not quite as good as a dummy battery. And there could be a few reasons for that. Maybe because it's touching right on the bottom, maybe because the heat source is close, but it does get quite hot, like if you touch it here or in here where the grip is, or even underneath, like if you pop the screen out and you touch it behind the screen, it gets really hot there, which by the way, means you have to have this screen out. If you run this thing for like 2 hours and then you close the screen, it will shut down the heat within like 20 seconds. It's crazy. It just immediately goes like temperature warning and then shuts down. So all these tests are only relevant with the screen out. And if ever you're doing some kind of hot rundown, make sure the screen is out and that you set the camera to the high temperature shutoff. But when you do run it like that, it's not for hand holding anymore. Now it's for like tripod use, because you're not going to burn yourself by just touching it. But I think if you held it for a really long time, you could get those long duration, low temperature burns, which is probably why I often get asked questions of why would Sony allow you to have a high heat option? And I think it's based on that. If you keep it on the standard heat shutoff setting, that's good for hand holding the camera. If you put it on high, that's better for tripods and that kind of thing, where there's not as much of a concern for low temperature burns. Anyway, keep the screen away, put the grip on, put a couple batteries in there, and yeah, you can get not quite 3 hours because the batteries won't last that long, but close to it. And it also still works out with the 128 gig card thing. Remember I was saying that one battery is worth about one 128 gig card? So if I put 2 in there, right around the same time that the battery only had a few percentage left, there was only a few minutes left on the second card after it switched. This was a room temperature environment, by the way, but if you want sort of just what can I do with 8K as simply as possible, you could get the A1, you could get the vertical grip, and you could get 2 128 gig V60 cards, pop them in there, and you could basically just run it all down. You run down your batteries and your cards, you'll get about 2 hours and 40 minutes, and then that's that. And that's pretty good for 8K, like that's a pretty great result. I can't say in the hot sun that you're gonna get the same results, you probably won't, but the camera does recover quickly too, which is great. Okay, so the USB thing, which is what I wanted to mention. When I did my initial A1 review, the only time that I got worse overheating performance is when I used USB-C, because there's power delivery in the last 3 cameras, I think, from Sony, all have power delivery, or at least the last 2. So if you stick something in the USB-C, you can charge the battery, yes. And this is without the grip as well. And you can also actively power it, where it only loses like 1% or 2% an hour. So you could run it essentially indefinitely. But when shooting 8K, I found that I was only getting 40 to 50 minutes of runtime instead of the regular 80 to 90 minutes, which made me think that this active powering charging thing was heating up that battery inside the camera even more. However, when using the grip, it's better. So you can still, this is actually kind of great, is when you have the grip installed and you charge it this way, over USB-C, you don't plug it into the grip. There is no USB-C port on the grip, but you actually still charge the 2 batteries inside of the grip just from this one cable. So it's actually a really convenient way to charge both batteries, because you don't have to take them out and put them into 2 separate chargers. You can just charge the whole unit like this. But what about overheating? It didn't seem to as much. I was able to run this for, I think, I ran it for 3 hours and 15 or 3 hours and a half, just to basically see, do I get more than the 2 hours and 40 minutes, or does it overheat faster? And it did not overheat faster. I got greater than I did of running 2 batteries by just having USB-C. Maybe it would have run for longer. Again, it was quite hot though. This time I'm keeping it charged with USB power delivery. And so far I'm at 3 hours and 15 minutes with no overheat warning yet, but it is very, very hot to the touch. So what that tells me is that by having the grip installed, that the flow now is, because it's charging sort of through the dummy battery and into the grip, it's not putting the heat into the body like if you were charging the battery inside the camera. Which means that there might be a little trick here, because as we just tested on video, you can run it with only 1 battery inside. So maybe the most economical solution, because you do have to provide the batteries for the grip, that it doesn't come with 2 batteries, but your camera comes with 1. So you could get the grip and just put the 1 battery from the camera inside the grip, thus removing the battery from the body and putting in the grip, and then connect a USB-C cord and effectively run the camera for a really long time like that. Basically getting similar results to what you would get from a dummy battery, but just hotter. I think this would be a warmer option. The dummy battery, the camera never gets as hot. If you're gonna run mains power, the dummy battery is the best option because you don't need to spend the extra money on a V-mount battery or something like that. But if you were thinking how much for the rig and then the V-mount and then the dummy battery, that can add up. And this might be the cheaper solution at that point. But if you're gonna go to mains, I would just go with the dummy battery. But anyway, this works, and it works for charging, and it works for running longer than 3 hours, again, in a room temperature environment. Okay, so that's my little overheating update there. But I'm really impressed with the 8K runtime that I can get on this camera, especially considering, again, that you can do it with just V60 cards. That's probably the biggest difference there. But let's talk a little bit about some other options regarding recording. So if you were following me on Instagram or Twitter, if you're not, you should, because I've been posting stories there talking about this HDMI scaling thing that I noticed. So this is an a7S III, and we're gonna talk about this one in a minute, but if I do something like this where I record externally to the Ninja 5, I noticed something. Well, okay, first of all, the reason why I thought of this is because if you remember from my A1 review, I mentioned that when you're recording 4K, it's a pixel binned image. It's not an oversampled 8K image. But what's interesting is that you can set the camera to 8K and set the external resolution differently. So in all of the Sony cameras, at least the last dozen Sony cameras, you can check this if you have one yourself. I'll put this up on screen right now. But if you go into the menu, if you go into the regular recording options, you can set your camera to 4K or HD. Maybe you've got more options than that. On the A1, you've also got the 8K option. But then if you go into the yellow menu and you go down, there's the external output or HDMI output options. And in there, you can choose what resolution the HDMI output port is putting out as well. And normally you have an option like 2160p or 1080p. So basically that's saying, are you putting out 4K over HDMI or 1080p over HDMI? What's interesting about the A1 is that you have the option to output 4320p or 8K over HDMI, as well as 2160p and 1080p. But you can set the camera, the internal recording to 8K, and it doesn't lock you out of anything. So what I was thinking was that how is it possible that they could both read the sensor in two different ways? They could read the 8K and let you record 8K internally, but also simultaneously pixel bin that down to 4K over HDMI. And I thought that's not possible without, increasing the latency or maybe the rolling shutter get worse or something, and it doesn't. So that made me think that they weren't also binning the image simultaneously when in 8K mode. So what I did is I did some shots. I did a shot at 8K, then I did a shot with the camera set to 4K and also the HDMI output set to 4K. But then I did another one where the camera was set to 8K to record 8K internally, but the HDMI output was set to 4K. And I compared these shots. Now something to keep in mind is you don't actually have to record internally. You're just setting the internal resolution. And one thing that kind of supports this is that if you have the internal resolution set to 8K, the battery life is worse than if you have it set to 4K, whether or not you record internally or not. This is just recording externally, which sort of supports what I'm saying, that the sensor is obviously being read at 8K, regardless of whether or not you're recording it internally or not. So when I compared these images, the image that was recorded with the camera set to 8K and the HDMI outputting 4K and recorded externally on a Ninja 5, that image was cleaner and looked more like an 8K image than the image if you set the camera to 4K and record externally 4K to the Ninja. And you can see this really clearly if you look at just the noise. The noise is finer and much more like smaller particles instead of like blended ones. Particles, what am I talking about? Smaller little dots, smaller little pixels than like merged ones. And there were some shots where there was like detail where I was looking at a texture and the texture almost just blurred into nothing with the 4K over 4K, but when doing 8K with a 4K output, the texture came back. So I really do think that we're getting an oversampled 8K image out of the 4K HDMI externally if the camera's set to 8K mode. And again, the only con here is that you're going to get the battery life of an 8K recording instead of the battery life of the 4K recording. You're going to get basically an oversampled, similar to Canon's 4K HQ mode on the Canon R5, but instead of internal, this is an external 4K HQ. And it does look better, and you can record it with a nicer codec that you can edit straight away, so it's more efficient. It's probably going to be the same. I got a similar result to if I just oversampled the 8K or downsampled the 8K myself in post, but that does require you to record 8K and get SD cards and manage the media and that kind of thing. So that's the best image, but this is a very, very, very close second image, or second place image, and it is better than just straight set the camera to 4K, output to 4K. Now I know the next question is going to be, what about other cameras? And what about HD and 4K? Like, so I took the a7S III, for example. I did where the camera's set to 4K and I recorded out to 4K. I also did it where the camera's set to HD and I output to 4K. So that made the 4K image on the external recorder worse. So if you set your internal recording to HD and output 4K, it looks worse than if you set the internal to 4K and 4K. And if you do the reverse, if you set the camera to 4K, but your HDMI output is only HD, which people often do with streaming, or maybe you just want to record really long form stuff, so you need HD recording externally so you can record for like 10 hours, that HD will look better if the camera's set to 4K than it will look if the camera's set to HD and HD. Probably putting these up on the screen while I'm talking about this, but it might be hard for you to see on YouTube. If it's not really translating well on YouTube, you just have to trust me, it does look better. How much better? Well, it looks the same way if you've ever upscaled something before. There's a benefit. It looks better when you downscale a higher resolution image. It's never going to look better than the timeline resolution, but it does look like a bit of a sharper image went into it, and the noise performance is better as well. So even on the older Sony cameras that only do 4K and HD, if you're somebody that tends to record in HD externally, make sure you have the camera set to 4K because you will get, again, another sort of oversampling benefit from that. And I think this is going to work on a lot of Sony cameras, or at least all the ones that have those same HDMI options. I didn't test on everything. I tested on 3 different bodies, and it worked on all of them. But, you know, I don't have every Sony camera to test right now. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is the S-Cinetone update, which came out just a few days ago for the a7S III. And the main thing is it's just important to recognize, you know, I think it was 2 or 3 videos where I complained saying, put S-Cinetone in the a7S III. You keep showing me that it's possible, so do it. So now I just need to publicly recognize they did it. Great job, Sony. Appreciate you listening and adding it. A lot of people wanted it, and now it's there, and great. But I will give you some notes on S-Cinetone because I was asked about this in the comments and on social. Just some basic things. S-Cinetone is really easy, so don't worry about it too much. But the native ISOs, because, you know, on the a7S III, it always cleans up 4.33 stops higher. So the 2 ISOs for that would be ISO 100. That's your first base. And then if you get up to ISO 2000, it switches over and cleans up again. So you're much better off shooting at 2000 than at 1600, let's say. But yeah, 100 and 2000. And the maximum zebra level for S-Cinetone is 109 plus. So if you use the lower limit C2, whatever for zebras, set it to 109 plus. And then regarding exposure, you expose it much more naturally than S-Log. S-Cinetone is a much more like what you see is what you get profile. So look at it in camera and expose it to look good in camera if you have a monitor or whatever, and do that. But do protect your highlights. It's better to protect your highlights with these more cine style profiles because they do a little bit better in the shadows. You know, with S-Log, we're always trying to expose to the right so we can push it down and clean up the shadows. And that still does work, but the shadows are already a bit more contrasty, and so you will see some of that noise kind of hidden. So you're better off protecting your highlights, and you can kind of boost the shadows a little bit more than you could with something like S-Log. But again, just expose it to look natural in camera, but protect your highlights. You do have a bit more dynamic range than the standard PP off or movie gamma, so you will have a little bit more latitude on both ends, but the dynamic range is definitely reduced compared to S-Log 3. You're looking at maybe 1.5 to 2 stops worse than S-Log 3, but better than PP off. So if you remember when I did that big like 40-minute video that was, you know, looking at all the picture profiles and that kind of thing, I said that I wish that the a7S III had sort of a sweet spot because the cine gammas are a nice balance of dynamic range, but there's no color profile that matches those cine gammas that I think looks great. I don't like pro and I don't like still and that kind of thing. What I like is the creative neutral style, but you only get creative neutral if you put PP off, and PP off has worse dynamic range than cine. So I was like, there's no way to combine those two, and I wish there was. That's kind of what S-Cinetone is. Think of it kind of like creative style neutral mixed with a cine gamma. It's a great sweet spot for a fast turnaround image. Good, accurate color, a decent amount of dynamic range, looks good right at a camera. You can see what you're doing right at a camera. It's a really nice balanced profile. If you want the best of the best you can get out of the camera, it's still S-Log 3, and you should still follow anything I've said before about how to use S-Log 3, and that's still what I shoot. But S-Cinetone is there, and it's kind of a no-brainer now for if you want fast turnaround. You don't have to worry about which gamma with which profile. Just put it on PP11, expose it how it looks good in camera, and run with it, and I think you'll have really good results. And that's everything I want to discuss. Now, I just need to come up with some more excuses to give to Sony to let me test the A1 further, because I do not want to give this camera back. It's pretty great. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video entertaining, or at least helpful. And if you did, make sure to leave the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, try setting the playback speed to 75%. Yeah, all right. I'm done.